Catherine Delahunty.
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair, tēnā koe te whare. This is not just a housing crisis, this is a moral crisis. This country is actually in moral crisis as I speak. So this SOP is important, like all of the SOPs, because what they do is articulate to the country, and people are watching us here tonight, articulate to the country that some people recognise the crisis and some people recognise that practical, affordable and reasonable steps need to be taken to work our way out of this crisis. As the previous speaker said around this SOP, it is disturbing to think about our kids right now outside in the cold. As yet another wintry blast hits the country, there are kids outside in the cold, there are parents trying to get them out of the cold. Meanwhile, in Parliament, there's a bill before the House that will not help that situation at all because it has missed the point. And it would be easy to say deliberately, it would be kind to say they just kind of made a mistake. They meant to produce a wonderful housing bill that was going to work it all out. But this SOP is important because it actually spells out the issue around income-related rents. And you can't separate the word rent from the word income. Well, if you do, you're obviously living in the fool's paradise or you're really rich. But the main thing is, we were here about a week ago arguing about the minimum wage. We were arguing that there should be a minimum wage for contractors, and the government...
Order.
I'm about to link it.
Well, it would be very good if the member did quite quickly, because I think you heard the previous ruling. I think it's fair to say that this part was marginal as to its scope, and the member's getting a fair way outside speaking directly to it.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'd like to get directly to the relationship between income-related rent and the minimum wage, i.e. if you're not getting the minimum wage, you can't even pay the rent. I think that's within scope. The joint ministers in the SOP must ensure sufficient funding is available for income-related rent in Housing New Zealand houses. The good thing about this SOP is it attributes responsibility to these joint ministers, not only in 12 and Section 72, but also in 98B, joint ministers must ensure sufficient places for emergency housing. So what it does is it actually names that the ministers of the Crown as responsible. This is appropriate because the state has a responsibility to look after housing, and this is what this bill's about. It's about the role of the state. The joint ministers must ensure all people who are homeless have the ability to access accommodation and the services they need. And at risk of deviating, we have to look at Te Puia Marae. They acted like the joint ministers. That's what they did. They acted like, maybe we should write in here, the joint ministers, as a reflection of the leadership provided by Te Puia Marae, will act to provide sufficient places for emergency housing. Because the leadership came from the people, and 98B is all about the joint ministers must ensure the number of funded places available in emergency housing each year is not less than 8,000. Now, I'm sure that we would need all of those places, and I'm sure that what we saw at the marae was about the need for ongoing emergency housing. And I personally am aware, having visited Whangarei, which is not Auckland, but there's a crisis in emergency housing in Whangarei. There's a crisis in emergency funding and housing in Dunedin. There's a crisis in my own town in Thames. There's always a crisis in emergency funding because no one's taking responsibility for the overall picture and is just leaving it to agencies who are desperate, and then they've cut the community funding for that. So those joint ministers, I'm not sure who they are, but the joint ones will get together and do something about it and make sure there are the places that are funded. The emergency housing is warm, dry and safe. So it's not just that the joint ministers must ensure these places exist, but they can't just say any old dirty boarding house will do. What they have to say is premises which are warm, dry and safe. And I think safe is a critical word in this SOP. It's very good that it's mentioned, because if our kids aren't safe, we're not safe, No one is safe while our kids aren't safe. We need to do this. This SOP needs to go ahead.
Sue Williams.